Okay, first and foremost, can everybody see my slides? Can you see that okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay. So as a way of introduction, I'm Doug Wright. I'm a professor. I'll talk a little bit about my background a little bit more. I am the INBRE PI. And I, over the years, the INBRE program is fundamentally designed to help support people through grant mechanisms. And what we've noticed over the years is that we get a wide range of grant applications: fantastic, mediocre, crazy, whatever. And one of our primary missions is to make people more competitive for biomedical research funding. And so what we thought we would start to begin to do is develop some educational components to help people who maybe this is their first grant, or they're very experienced grant writers, or whatever stage you're at. You can always learn a little bit more about grant writing. I would say that grant writing is an art. We have a term, grantsmanship, that we use to talk about that process of writing grants. And it can be overwhelming at times, particularly when you're new. How do I get started? What are the things that I need to think about? And then it can be very frenetic as you get close to the deadline and you're working to get that submission, and you didn't recognize or didn't prepare yourself to be able to handle all of the variables that come with getting a grant submitted, including your own ability to get things written, but also your university's ability to get grants out. And so what I'm going to talk about today is some of the things that I've learned over the years to help me become a better grant writer, some of the experiences. This is built off a grant writing workshop that I do for graduate students every year. And I've modified it to kind of fit a broad range of folks, from trainees to experienced researchers. I'm sure that if you're an experienced and successful grant writer, you have your own opinions and your own ways, but I'll bet that many of them are in parallel with the things that I'm going to talk about today. So this is not a session on, do I think your aims are good? This is, how do you go about the process, the art of writing a grant and allow you to be successful? So I am going to try and spend about 45 minutes in terms of the preparation. What do you do to get ready to be able to kind of get into that process, and what are some of the variables that you need to think about? Claire, if you can ping me about 12:45, just so I know what the time is, and so I don't start telling too many stories, which I do. And then we're gonna 12:45 to 1:45. We're gonna really talk about the specifics of aspects of the grant that I think are critically important. And maybe if you guys can all mute your microphones, that'd be great. So we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of a grant, and then I want to leave time for questions, right? Because I hope that this will stimulate questions from all of you, and I want to be able to try and answer as many of those as I can. So why am I qualified to do this? I've heard plenty of grant writing sessions where the people that were providing the information were actually not grant writers, or may not have had successfully gotten a grant before. So that, I think, is important, right? So for me personally, this is what I've been doing for a long time. I have been able to pull in over $85 million in NIH grant funds to our university over my 27 years. In large part, that is part by the K-INBRE grant, which is a very large grant. So that's inflated to some degree. However, I have an R01 grant that it's in its 18th continuous year, meaning I wrote it when I had hair the first time, and then I've had to renew it 4 times. So I am fairly comfortable in terms of writing new applications, but also renewals, which are very different processes. I've been a PI on a range of different types of grants. So an R grant, a P grant, a U grant, a training T32 grant, which I'm now currently the PI on. I have done a lot of reviewing for NIH and other entities, for foundations and other entities. So I have seen a lot of grants. I understand what is a good grant and what is a bad grant. I served 6 hard years as a regular member of study section, where we reviewed commonly 120 grants over a 2-day period, and I would have anywhere from 10 to 15 grants that I was responsible for reviewing. At the end of that, I was asked to chair that study section for 2 years. So I also got a perspective in terms of how reviewers are reviewing grants. I currently serve as the chair of 2 NIH study sections. I'm trying to get out of it, but I keep getting asked back for it. Probably what I'm most proud of is that over my entire career, I've only had 2 NIH grants that didn't get discussed. And we'll talk a little bit about that process, but getting discussed is the first step in the door, right? If you can't sell your product to the reviewers, you're not going to get discussed. I think personally, getting your grant discussed is really about grant writing, about grantsmanship. It's putting together a document that a reviewer can understand and is willing to take chances and review that or speak publicly about that grant. If you don't write a good grant that's clear, it's very easy for reviewers not to like it, and then it gets not discussed. So that is half the battle, is just getting discussed, and I've only done that twice, and I know exactly why, and that still burns me that I didn't get discussed on those, but that's another topic. Okay, so you're here, you're interested in learning about how to become a better grant writer. Oftentimes I'll talk to folks and they'll be like, I really don't know if I want to get into this. It's too competitive. NIH pay lines are ridiculously low. Even this year, they're still not increasing. So it is competitive. The funding sources are limited, but there is money out there. And if you don't submit it, you won't get it, right? So my philosophy is, let's put it in and see what happens. Another common component that I hear is I don't have good ideas. I disagree with that. I think I would also say that my science, probably not the most innovative, exciting science in the world, but I am a good grant writer, and that makes up for a lot of mediocre ideas because I can make them clear and I can allow the reviewer to understand where I'm going with that and what it means. I'm not a great grant writer.
Oh.
Yeah, that's probably a common component. And that's what we're here for today, is to kind of try and eliminate some easy mistakes that you might make as a writer that is preventing your grants from being funded. So first step, you should all at this point, hopefully everybody in this audience has done these things or can do these things. One is to make sure that you have an NIH ERA Commons idea. If you're part of the INBRE program, you likely already have one. But if you're a trainee who's just getting started in this process, you're going to need an ERA Commons ID, and that has to be done through your institution. Email your sponsored program administrators, and they will get you set up with an account. Or if you're not sure about that, you can ask Hayata and Claire here how to get an ERA Commons component. Secondly, you need to develop a biosketch. Different funding agencies have different forms of this, but they're generally an abbreviated version of your CV. And if you're working with the K-INBRE, hopefully you've already got a biosketch. I would say stay aggressive and keep that up to date all the time, and make it personal to the mechanism that you're applying for, right? A cookie cutter biosketch that has information that's not relevant to that grant application likely can hurt you a little bit. It'll probably irritate the reviewer because they know that you didn't spend the time to personalize that biosketch. So I have, 100 different saved versions for the biosketches that I will either use for my grants or use for other folks' grants, and I personalize all of those in those first couple of paragraphs to make sure that the reviewer knows that I'm interested in and this mechanism is important to me. So that's a very quick step. Make sure that your NCBI list of publications is up to date as well. That's can irritate reviewers. If your link doesn't work in your biosketch and they want to see your publication history and it doesn't work, you've now irritated the reviewer, which doesn't help you. And then I think a really important point that everyone should use is to go on, particularly for biomedical research, NSF has its own version of this, but to go on NIH Reporter, which the link is here. This is a searchable database that NIH puts together that has a huge amount of information about grants that have been funded. So this includes all of the different types of grants. You can search, you can use all sorts of different advanced search criteria to go in and select to look what you're looking for. So for example, if you want to find out who's doing research in your area and what it's on, you can do a topical search. If you want to find out is there a collaborator that I might want to work with who's funded, you can do that. I use this NIH Reporter constantly. I'm trying to gain information about what is being funded, what study sections are seeing this, what types of dollars are being spent on this particular area, what's happening in Kansas, what's happening with my collaborators. So I'm constantly in this database. This is a very valuable tool to kind of provide a background for the information that's going to help you shape your grant. So for example, if I have a particular topic, I'm going to go in and see what institutes are funding this, right? And what kind of research are they funding in that particular area? So if I want to go to my favorite institute, the Neurological Disorders Institute, NINDS, I will go in and search selectively to see what NINDS is funding in that particular area. If my topic is outside of that area, but maybe funded by NIDDK or some other agency, I might craft my application a little bit differently because I know it might be more appealing to a different institute. So I use this database constantly. I think this is an incredibly valuable tool that people underutilize when they're trying to find information about how to get started and where do I go and what institute might be appropriate, what's funded already. So if you haven't played in that, I can burn entire days on NIH Reporter just looking for information about where I need to go. Okay, this is a Kansas INBRE webinar, so I just wanted to highlight that Kansas INBRE has just undergone a successful renewal. I just checked the website and we still don't have our notice of award yet, HEADA, so we're still waiting on that. However, the next 5 years will be funded, and the types of grants that we're going to support within the state of Kansas are shown here. We actually have a little bit of a change in the focus. We're going to spend a lot more money funding folks at the undergraduate institutions than we have in the past, right? That means that we have new grant writers that are entering into the field, and that's the purpose of this, is to help folks with that. So if you're a new faculty member in Kansas, you're eligible to write a DRPP grant. If you want to do research in the summer, we have summer grants, appropriately named spring grants. Don't get fooled by that, but they're basically designed to help support research in the summer. We have new awards that will support educational activities, research in the classroom, CURE awards. Many of you might be familiar. If you're in leadership positions or running cores, we have core facility grants. We have bridging grants to help folks in between funding or to help get them that R01 or R21 or R15. And then we also have data science core awards as well. Please make sure you check out our website to learn about those types of grants. We are through the funding cycle already this year, but the next cycle will be in December, basically. So one of the reasons we wanted to do this seminar now is to give you time, if you're looking at those November, December deadlines for the INBRE, to help craft that and to use your summertime to be able to get ahead of these grants and get them out and ready for the December deadlines. If you're going for NIH grants, you're new to this, it's overwhelming sometimes in terms of the types of grants that are available. There are a whole host of R-series grants, R15s, R01s, R21s. You have to go in and really look at those mechanisms. There are career development awards, and they have a mentoring component generally. They're a little bit different flavor. There are training grants and fellowships. I got to write my first T32 training grant during COVID because I had some free time, so I made a bad decision and wrote one of those and got funded. But we're working with our students all the time to write F award grants. The INBRE grant is an example of a P-series grants. These are large center grants. there's a lot of different resource grants, and there's also programs that bridge outside of NIH, so DoD or other sorts of programs. They are all unique in terms of what they require. And one of the things that you'll take away from this is that you have to spend the time up front reading the announcements and making sure that your grant fits with all of those and you've crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's. Foundation grants are another potential source of funding, and they can even be more restrictive in terms of the criteria that they need. So you really have to pay attention to their announcements and make sure you follow all of the rules. Okay. One of the big steps that you kind of need to think about and you don't think about commonly is that you cannot submit this grant on your own. You're going to need to work with your research office at your institution. And that is critically important in terms of your success. We've had examples here recently where faculty didn't appropriately work with the research office and they were not able to submit their grants. And that's tragic. But we, as faculty, need to bear that burden and be ready to work with our research office because it's unique in every different place. So your institution might have deadlines in order for you to get your grant out on time. It might be 2 or 3 weeks in which you need to be supplying them information. You need to have discussions with them regularly about that and be aware that they have workload issues. They may get a ton of grants around a deadline and make it really difficult. So you need to be aware of that and have a clear understanding of when you need to get information to them. You're going to need to build a budget. Budgeting is not trivial. I still struggle with it a little bit. Generally, when I start early, I can at least have an idea of what my budget might look like, or at least a framework. So the funding opportunity announcements, the FOAs, this is where the information about the grant is going to come from. It will generally have precise information about the budget requirements. You need to look at that. There are easy mistakes that you can make just because you requested items or did not request budget components that were required in the FOA. So you have to go through that FOA. I generally go through it with a fine-tooth comb. I do a lot of highlighting. I make sure I make a checklist to make sure that I have met all of those budgetary requirements. Sometimes you need to reach out to the program officer at NIH or to the INBRE staff. It is encouraged for you to reach out to me or Hayata or Claire if you have questions about your budget. We can help you with that. So just kind of throwing it in there without any input is dangerous, and I would worry about that. There might be internal institutional requirements as well. For example, here at KU Med, we have to submit our NIH budget, but then we have a completely different form we have to file as an internal budget, which makes no sense to me, and I've argued about it a lot, but that is one of the requirements that you have to meet. And so you might have to be aware of those sort of concerns that your research office might have. Oftentimes, I think people will make a budget and they will write a grant, and the budget and the grant don't line up. So when I'm thinking about what types of information I want to put in my grant, I have my budget sort of kind of framed out. And the reason I do that is because I don't want to propose experiments that are well outside the budget, right? Generally, most funding mechanisms are going to have a limit. What can I do with that? What can I do within that limit in terms of proposing experiments that I would like to do? So I see that oftentimes where you'll have a budget and you'll have a grant proposal, and the grant proposal is not even close budgetarily into what you can actually get from that. So make sure that you write your grant with your budget in mind. There is no benefit to submitting a grant that doesn't go to the maximum of the amount that's allowable. I think that it's not going to impress your reviewers to convince them that you can do the work for less money. So make sure you write for the full amount, but also make sure it fits, right? I mean, in some cases, if your project doesn't need that much money, I think it's fine. I think you just need to be very clear in the justification of why that's the case. And that sometimes that is to your benefit, but most of the time it's not. So I generally, sort of think about, okay, what's my limit? I'm going to write to that limit, but also make sure that it's appropriate, what I'm putting in there. Oftentimes there's a cost sharing component. And I still don't understand cost sharing. I was trying to learn about it this week. That is an institutional commitment that they're going to support somehow financially your research. Cost sharing can be very tricky. And so if you're not sure about that, and I'm not, I always ask K-INBRE or my program officer or the research office about whether I should request a cost sharing component for my institution or not. Generally speaking, try to avoid it. So that's an important aspect of that. Your institution likely might have a platform which they submit grants. We use my sponsored projects here. I wouldn't rank this platform in my top 100 platforms. I hate it. It's awful, but that's what we're stuck with. That's my opinion if you're online and you're from KUMC and you don't like my opinion, but it's terrible. But we work with it. There may be other aspects about this that you're going to need. Are you going to need prior approval of IACUC or animal care? Are you going to need IRB or human subjects requirement? Those all have to kind of be in place, or at least know when you're putting your grant together whether you're going to need that prior to submission or you're able to do it afterwards. Is there safety office requirements as part of that? You need to be aware of that because that can hang you up when you get ready to submit and they're like, well, you need IACUC approval. And you're like, well, that's going to take 6 weeks. So you just need to be aware of that. One general piece of advice I would say is the grants management offices work very hard. I have not really seen anybody that's not stressed in that office. They are trying as hard as they can, but they're overwhelmed oftentimes. And so it's important to be nice to them. Doug, I'm telling myself that, and not to start too late. They're overworked and they have a lot of things going on. So try to work with them as best as possible. A little bit about the review process, because I think this is important when you're thinking about grant writing. So you're going to submit your application and there's going to be a group of people that is going to read your grant and then be prepared to sort of present that grant orally, online, on Zoom, and talk about that grant. Rule number one about reviewers is they are overburdened, right? So not only are they looking at your grant, but probably many others, right? It is very natural for them to make comparisons within their portfolio, within their group of grants that they're studying, and they're going to sort out what are my good grants, what are my bad grants, right? What do I think I can defend? There is a personal aspect of this to this, even though you really don't want to do that, but that happens all of the time. So you want to put yourself to be in position to be one of those good grants that your reviewer is excited about and ready to sort of talk about. We are taught as reviewers to, there's going to be a range of scoring. It's generally 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, whatever that is. We are taught to start in the middle. When I crack open that PDF, it used to be a page, as I'm doing the page, but now it's when you open the PDF, I start to think about if it's a range from 1 to 10, like NIH is commonly. Okay, this grant is a 5, and I'm going to start reading that grant, and I'm going to be moving my perception of this grant either better, 4, 3, 2, 1, or worse, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? And it kind of fluxes back and forth. And at the end, I'm going to have to come up with a score, right? That tells you immediately that the first thing that they're going to are going to look at is going to really influence their decision in a positive or negative fashion. So you want the start of your grant to be really good. If you write a bad Ames page, and we're going to talk about that, you've already started to move that reviewer to the bad side, right? To the worst side. And so getting started off the right foot is really important. The reviewer is going to have to either write a written review or an oral review of your grant. In that, they're going to use strengths and weaknesses that they can perceive in your grant. If you have a grant that you can't pull out strengths and weaknesses very easily because it's confusing or doesn't read well, it's all going to be weaknesses. They're going to look at your grant and say, look, I'm really struggling with this. Or you're going to get reviews that don't make sense, but the reviewer really couldn't pull out a strength or a weakness. I make it easy on them. I will identify strengths that I know are strengths of this grant, and I'll put that into place in my grant and say, these are the strengths of this grant. They can go to that section, and oftentimes I'll see it just given right back to me in terms of my review. So strengths of this grant, and it'll be exactly what I wrote for them, right? I made it easy for them to pull out that. I will oftentimes write in weaknesses of my own grant. I know what the weaknesses are. I oftentimes will say one recognized weakness of my grant is this point. It'll pop up in the review because it makes it really easy for them to do that. So think about what their process is and make it easy on them to pull out different components that they're going to have to use when they write a review or present this orally. That is an important aspect of how you should write your grants. Knowing what they need to do and making it easy on them is a really important point. So oftentimes I will right up front list strengths, and then at the end I'll list my weaknesses as well, just so they recognize that I've thought carefully about this. I know this is not a perfect proposal. I may not have all the expertise that I need in this particular area, and I'll point that out. But I'll also work to kind of make sure that they can see how we're working on our weaknesses or how we might overcome that process. So understanding the review process is important. Make it easy on your reviewers. We talked a little bit about the range. Oftentimes there's a range. The range can vary depending on the mechanism that you're writing for or the agency that you're writing for. NIH usually uses a 1 to 10 range. In the NIH proposals, generally there are hard scoreable items, meaning the reviewer is going to have to assign a number to each of these and then come up with a final overall score that they might have to do that. So within NIH proposals, you'll see things that they're going to think about. Is this proposal significant? Is there a need to do this work? They're going to evaluate you as an investigator. And if you're not strong, you need to make sure that you put people on your grant that help buffer that weakness. They're going to look at, is this innovative? Is it incremental? What are the new things that we're going to get from this grant that really move the field forward? That is an art in itself. I think a lot of times I see the innovation section of grants not being done well, and it's hard, but I think that there are some ways to kind of think about that. The approach is the meat and potatoes of the grant, right? Here's my hypothesis. Here's the experiments that we're going to do to test that hypothesis. These are the tools that we're going to use. These are the outcomes that we anticipate or don't anticipate. That is oftentimes where reviewers can pick you apart if you don't do a good job in terms of your approach. And then environment. Environment is a hot topic right now. I think that NIH is recognizing that there's a bias associated with your environment, and I think they're trying to eliminate that. But if you're proposing to do work that you cannot complete at your institution, you better find a way to improve your collaborations in order to kind of get that done. And that's perfectly acceptable, right? I oftentimes put collaborators on that I know can do the work that I can't do here at KU Med, and that helps strengthen that component. That's actually viewed as a strength of that. So they're recognizing that the reviewers have scoreable issues or scoreable topics is really important. You better hit all of those. On the right side of the screen, you can see there are other components of grants that can impact the enthusiasm, as they say, of the grant reviewer. So did you do a good job with human subjects, vertebrate animal sections, biohazards? Is this a resubmission, and did you address all of the previous concerns appropriately? Is this a renewal? How are you moving this document forward? Are there foreign organizations involved? Are you using select agents? Is there a resource sharing plan? Super easy to irritate a reviewer if you are required to put a resource sharing plan in and you don't, right? Now that reviewer, even though that's not a scoreable component, is going to be a little bit aggravated because you didn't have that, right? So crossing your T's and dotting your I's, making sure that you have all of those in place will increase the enthusiasm of your reviewer when they go through that, so that when they are placing scores on these particular components, they're not already irritated because you didn't follow the directions in the funding announcement. So these are not to be dismissed like, I really don't need to worry about that because the scoreable items are really not. It's about perception, enthusiasm, confidence that as a investigator, if we give you this money, you're going to be able to carry that out. And part of that is convincing them through your rigor, crossing your T's and dotting your I's, making sure everything is in place. That's going to increase their enthusiasm about that. So I don't want to understate that. I think it's a really important part. I've seen lots of reviewers just kind of get really cranky because there were no components, non-scorable components in that, and that will diminish their enthusiasm. So you want to make it easy. You want to cross all your T's and dot all your I's in that. One component, and I think this is increasing, regularly, is that you may be writing with a collaborator. You might be writing a multi-PI grant. That is very common, or a team type of grant. Writing with a collaborator can be wonderful and it can be awful. So I think it's important to sort of, if somebody approaches you or you approach, say, hey, do you want to write a multi-PI grant on this? We have great ideas. Working with that collaborator can be stressful. People have different writing styles and they write at different paces. I think I've frustrated a lot of collaborators because I write very late in the process. I might be spending a lot of time thinking about the grant, but sometimes my writing doesn't start until I think, fairly late in the process. And so I know other people have different styles, and when I've written with them, they're like, man, you got to give me that draft. You need to see this. I'm like, I haven't even started to really piece together sentences that I think are coherent at this point, but it will get done. And so just have to be understanding of that, be patient with them. Hopefully you can find somebody that you can really work with in a great style. You need to be persistent in that. You need to clarify the roles that are going to be assigned within the grant and how that money is distributed. Do that early. There is no worse. It makes me uncomfortable when I have to have that discussion with people very late in the process, or even after the grant's been funded, about, hey, look, that money needs to go here or there. So have those conversations early. It's much easier. Obviously, meet and communicate regularly, and that's by hitting milestones and deadlines. When I'm writing a grant, I have my own internal deadlines, but when I'm writing with a collaborator, I really try and pay attention to those and hit them, because I know the people that I'm writing with, they need to sort of kind of see what's happening and see that we're making progress. And so I will work very aggressively to hit those deadlines as we move forward with the collaborator. It is fantastic. That's where science is moving. I think that the multi-PI or team science approaches are going to be more and more common because the science is too complex for anybody really to kind of manage on their own. And so I think that we all benefit from being able to write grants that have multiple PIs on them. There really is a benefit to that. Okay, so some of the biggest questions I get: how much time does it take? When should I start? That is an incredible variable that is dependent on the type of grant you're writing, your experience as a grant writer. The data sometimes will dictate that. If I don't have the data until very late, some of the writing doesn't get done in time. So I would say, as a general rule, it takes longer than you think, right? So if you think that you can write a grant in a month, I would probably start 3 months out because there are things that you can do up front that will help you. But again, that's very dependent on your experiences. If you're a graduate student and you're writing your first grant, 3 months better be, for sure. But I've written grants in 2 days, right? So I'm not saying doing that ever, because it's quite stressful, but sometimes that happens, and you can do that, but I also have a lot of experience in that as well. The first thing I look at is how much writing do I need? What are the page limits, right? As I've gotten older, and for those of you who have been around a long time, NIH grants used to commonly be 25 pages. That's a lot. When I look at that now, I'm like, there's no way I can fill 25 pages. But I do look at that very quickly and say, okay, what are my page limits? If it's going to be a large, complicated grant, I'm going to start very early. If it's a, 1-page specific aims and 5 of the research proposal, I might not have to start 3 months in advance. So I don't have a good answer. It's really just the more times you've done it, they get better, the faster you get at it. So other things that will impact that: do you have collaborators, right? Is this a multi-PI grant? Are you going to have co-investigators? Are you going to have consultants that you might need letters of support? Those always take longer than you think. And then where do you start in this process? I immediately oftentimes go to my pre-award specialist at our institution and let them know that I'm thinking about writing this grant and giving them the funding announcement so they can start to piece together some things that I'm going to require. In many, many cases, it is recommended to speak to the program officers at NIH or whatever agency you're, the grants management person, whatever you're submitting to. They can provide you, in some cases, not all cases, really good information about the grant. And they can probably give you a feel whether the institute or the agency is interested in that kind of research. And they can probably sometimes give you some advice in terms of things that you can do and not do in terms of that. And then I will back that up by going on NIH Reporter and seeing, what grants they were associated with and what they're funding, because you can also sometimes go back and check on that and say, okay, yeah, they're right. They're really funding a lot of grants in this particular area, and I need to think about that. Making a checklist is critically important, right? So you're going to open the funding announcement. I make a checklist of all the things that I'm going to need, require, and then I can check those off as I move through those. And that oftentimes is like if I'm in a writing slump and I'm like, okay, I haven't written a cohesive sentence in 2 days, I'll go and do some other stuff on the grant just so I can cross some things off my checklist, just so I can make progress and feel like, okay, I know it's not happening today, but I think that I can get some stuff done. So the checklist is really good, and at the end, it pays off. I put together a preliminary budget fairly quickly. If you don't know how to do that, or you're not sure what to do, certainly ask Kayada. She's got a lot of experience in that. She could, particularly with the INBRE grants, she can help you with that process. And then I have a timeline with milestones that I rarely hit personally, but if I'm writing with a collaborator, I will do that for sure. Trying to hit my milestones. Something else to think about: are you going to need letters of support? If so, that takes time. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but you may have to write a draft for that. So that's time that you're going to have to invest to get those letters of support to the letter writers and make sure you get them back in time. Sometimes they're submitted with your grant, or maybe perhaps they're submitted as a separate component. So you need to know that as well. And just basic word processing, save multiple drafts. I don't know how many times I've had a fantastic day of writing, I really made progress, and something glitched and I lost it. So I have multiple drafts. You never want to get caught in a situation where all the work you've done is lost. So I have documents in all sorts of different places to kind of prepare for any sort of Microsoft Word or abnormality that happens, or your computer or the university changes the way your computer works, which happens daily here. Okay. Other forms that you just need to pay attention that are going to chew up your time, and I call these annoying forms. They're not annoying. I'm sure they serve a purpose, but when I'm grant writing and I'm really engaged in the topic and I'm thinking about that, and then I'm recognize, oh man, I got all these other things I need to do: internal approvals, routing forms, cost sharing, crazy university administrative stuff that drives me nuts. There are other form pages. There's budget and budget justification. There's a resources page, a project narrative, abstract, table of contents, sometimes, not so much anymore. All those things can chew you up. So if you don't do those and you get to the day of submission and your grants officer, the grants management person comes back and said, look, I need a justification, a narrative, and an abstract, and I need that in an hour. That has happened to me where I've just completely forgotten to do that. So be aware that there are other things that you're going to have to do that are outside the focus of the experiments when your grant that you're going to need to do. I don't think we need to probably cover this, but certainly absolutely no plagiarism, right? Be very careful about plagiarism and citing your work properly. Those can irritate reviewers in a heartbeat if they think that there's any sort of issue with your grant or there's no citations. That's going to irritate them. So just be very aware of that, and we should all strive to avoid plagiarism. And there are lots of programs online that you can run your text through to make sure that you're not plagiarizing and have some comfort about that. So we certainly want to adhere to these good practices, and reviewers oftentimes can pick up that stuff. So they just you want to avoid that at all costs. Some things that have evolved over time for me as a grant writer, I really recommend using editing software. I use Grammarly. I have a personal subscription to Grammarly. I think it's really improved my grant writing. I thought I was a pretty good writer. And then when you have Grammarly go through it and you're like, man, that sounds so much better. I think that that is an important aspect of that. Sorry. Have other people read the grant. This is a I have a lot of anxiety about people reading my stuff. I have to get better at it. I try to do that, but having people that are either outside your area or having a chance to just comb through it for clarity, I think is really important. Oftentimes we wait pretty close to the deadline to have somebody read our grant, and so maybe we don't get the feedback that we need because they don't have any time with that. Other issues that are arguable. I love these debates. Do you when you're writing your grant, do you have it fully justified or you just have it left justified? Lots of crazy opinions. I'm a proponent of full justified. I like my margins tight on the right side. It makes me feel comfortable. So I just use that, but there's no right or wrong there. It's whatever you're comfortable, and just make sure you're consistent. You don't want a document that's fully justified in one paragraph and not in the other. Sometimes that'll really irritate the reviewers. So the funding announcement might dictate what your font is and your font size, so pay attention to that. Arial 11 is a very commonly used. It's hard to go wrong with Arial 11. I think most people are comfortable when they're reading grants like that. Be aware of how big your figures are. It's a really bad mistake to really make tiny figures and say, oh, well, it's a PDF. They can just blow that up and look at it. Boy, you're going to irritate your reviewers in a heartbeat if they have to do that. And we're going to talk about that. I think it's an important component in terms of spacing and breathing room within the grant. Using figures that are large enough that breaks up the text is really important in that. Pet peeve, do not use abbreviations excessively. I try and limit it to the number of less than 3 or 4 abbreviations in an entire document. And you might argue, well, I need that space to write more. Well, that's a terrible argument. What you need to do is write more concisely and not use abbreviations, because when you use abbreviations, you're asking the reviewer to basically learn a new language very quickly, right? If that reviewer is not in your area, and oftentimes that's the case, and you have excessive abbreviations, it's going to aggravate them. It's going to drive them nuts. It drives me nuts. You're asking me to interpret all of these new abbreviations. So I absolutely avoid them. And I really work on the clarity of my grant to make sure that I have space to include all of those. That's what pet peeve I have is, you run through the first 3 paragraphs and there's 30 abbreviations. And I'm like, oh, I cannot follow this at all. And that's a really key component of being successful as a grant writer. So those are some things that I sort of think about as I start that process. I want to stop here and maybe take any questions that anybody might have or let you catch your breath a little bit. I only see Claire's message to me saying, goosing me along. So are there questions that anybody has at this point before we sort of jump into kind of some other aspects of writing?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So my name is Nancy Stewart. I'm in the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep. So I'm putting together a grant actually right now, and within AIMS 1 and 2, some of the mechanisms that we're going to be utilizing are surveys, and the surveys have, abbreviations like the names of the survey. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's super long. And I was told I've talked to a couple of folks on my mentorship team. I was told, oh yes, you want to include the, metric of observation, which is the survey abbreviation. But then I was told, no, don't put the abbreviation in. It's too confusing. And so in a situation like that, like, what are your recommendations? Because I'm kind of looking at it both ways, and I haven't made a decision yet on what I'm going to do, but I'm just curious your thoughts as a reviewer that wouldn't know
Yeah.
if I just said I'm going to be using validated questionnaires, like, is that sufficient enough in an aim and in a hypothesis on the specific same stage?
Uh, I mean, it's a great question, right? So there's no right or wrong answer, right? If that is sort of kind of a commonly used designation, and you feel like most people are going to be understand that, I would say use that. And the other part about this is that you don't want to use an abbreviation that you're just going to use one time. So if you're using that, if you're discussing that questionnaire over and over and over, and the reviewer can see it many times, yeah, it's probably okay to do that. But if you just have this designation and then you abbreviate it and then you use it one other time where they never see that, you're probably going to make it harder for them to remember that. So it's a judgment call on your part. I would say if that's critically important, because that's commonly used to refer to these questionnaires, perfectly fine. It's all of the other crazy stuff that gets abbreviated that you're just trying to save space. As a writer, I think that is very dangerous. I would not use abbreviations to save space, because you're just asking that reviewer to kind of think about something else instead of what you've written in the sentence. They're trying to figure out, okay, what is that? What does that refer to? And the moment that they have to go back and look for that abbreviation, ooh, that is a disruption in their reading. And so that's probably going to discourage them a little bit. So I try and use 4, 5, 6 abbreviations through the entire document. I try and write everything out unless it's a ridiculous, sort of name that, is just not feasible to do that. But I make sure that I use that abbreviation over and over and over so they get comfortable with it. So it's a great question.
Thank you.
There's no right or wrong. But if you can work towards reducing the number of abbreviations, we're reducing the workload on the reviewer, which is ultimately our goal, is to make it super easy for them. So good question. Any other questions? I don't see.
Yeah, we've got a couple in the chat
Okay.
here, Doug. When you speak about plot size, someone hears it very often, but nobody has ever really given a specific size recommendation. Could you give me a little bit more specific details rather than make sure the plot is big enough?
Yeah, so I would assume this is reviewing to figures, right?
I would assume so too.
Right. So making a multi-paneled figure that fits on a quarter of the width of the paper, that the reviewer is likely going to have to magnify to see those results, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So things that I would think about is, do you need all those panels, right? You need to selectively put data into your grant that supports it. If that big panel is filled with stuff that just was part of a paper figure or something like that, and you make it very small, you've now irritated the reviewer. So the other part about that is just be careful about what your data that you put in and make sure it supports your idea. Having figures in there that really don't apply, but maybe you're just too lazy to kind of pull it out and make a figure, I think is dangerous. Depends on, when I was younger, I could read all of those small figures very easily. Now I cannot. And so if I have to go in and sort of magnify stuff and see, you're losing me. You're pulling me away from what the important things about that. I don't think there's a right or wrong question. It's more of a, step back and take a look and say, you know what? I'm going to guess that the reviewer is going to have difficulty in seeing that, particularly if it's a fluorescent image where it's really small and you can't see that. You've immediately now distracted them from the important points that you're trying to make with that. So again, I don't have a right or wrong. but I think it's a general feeling where I'll probably use at least a third of the page width-wise to kind of use a figure. And as we'll talk about that, I think it breaks up the grants. It gives it a little bit of breathing room when you have figures that are large enough to be able to see comfortably, and it also gives you space on that. Again, no right or wrong, but it's just sort of kind of an experience of like, okay, that, I put that figure in there and that's way too small. So I need to sacrifice some language and make space for that figure so that it's not, that the reviewer doesn't get distracted by my figure size and instead of the data that it's presenting. So, and there was another figure now, or a figure question.
Yeah, I don't think it's about a figure, but just elaborate on what does environment mean in the context of significance investigator innovation.
Yeah. So environment has classically been one of the scoreable components for reviewers to sort of evaluate whether you, the applicant, has all of the things that you need to do to carry out that. So one of those is experience. And there's been a lot of pushback in terms of recognizing that there's probably bias in new investigators and early stage investigators. They are not going to have the track record that somebody who's been doing this for 30 years. And so we have to scale that. But some of the things that you will look at is if you don't provide information for them to evaluate you as your environment, right? You didn't list any resources that you have at your university. You didn't include any of the information that they can say, listen, this person is a small university, but they may not have all the resources, but what they did do was they provided collaborators that they know can do that. So we're all going to be judged at whatever career stage, and I would say there's certainly bias in terms of your institution and prestige. There's a lot of workshops that are happening at NIH and others to sort of eliminate that bias. But you as a grant writer can ensure the reviewer that you have all of the equipment, the things that you need to do, or the expertise either at your institution or through collaborators, consultants, and other sorts of things that will really bolster the environment component of that. I think, and I'm not sure, I should know this, but I think that they're probably seeking to remove that as a scoreable item because there is bias towards, if I write a grant from Kansas and somebody writes a very similar grant from Stanford, they have more resources, right? That's just the bottom line. Their environment is probably, better than my environment. So I may need to work to ensure confidence in the reviewer that we have everything we need to do, or all the people in place to make sure our environment is really going to be successful, allow us to be successful in the proposed aims. So another great question. Again, I think NIH and other agencies are really trying to recognize there is bias around that and trying to educate us better as reviewers and to really look closely at what is available to the investigator. So great question. Any other questions? Either raised hands or through the chat. All right. Okay. I will now, let's move forward and talk about the nuts and bolts of a grant. I recognize that there are a lot of different people who are going to be writing to a lot of different agencies, a lot of different types of grants. However, I feel like the things that we're going to discuss are all relevant to pretty much every grant. And I'm going to share with you my approaches in doing that and what I think are key components to each of these segments that allows me to be a better grant writer. So we're going to start and talk. We're going to spend a lot of time on specific aims because, as I mentioned, that's generally where most reviewers start with the grant, right? I'll flip through all the other sort of pages to get to the specific aims page. That's my window into the grant as a reviewer. So as you'll see, I spend a tremendous amount of time on the specific aims page because that's the entry point. That likely can dictate the enthusiasm of the reviewer immediately, positive or negative, right? So I want that to be a positive experience for them. I spend a lot of time on that. The innovation section is an NIH feature, but illustrating the innovation in your proposal is common across all proposals, right? What's interesting and new about this application? What are we going to learn? How's it going to move the field forward? So how do you write those? That's tricky. I think it's something that takes time to kind of learn. I'm still guessing sometimes whether I think something's innovative or not. I don't have a, I can't say that I'm a true expert on that. The research design component is the nuts and is the meat and potatoes, right? It is hypothesis, experiments, analysis, interpretation. I think those are critically important components of that. Certainly, I think all funding agencies are looking for rigor and reproducibility, right? Are we doing good science? Are we using controls? Are we using the right approaches to analyze that? You can ensure a lot of confidence in a reviewer by really stating these specifically and showing that you're going to carry out this research with rigor and reproducibility. Some of the things that are important to NIH appropriately now are sex as a biological variable. Is that important in your research, and what other capacity? I think probably where most grant writers stumble a little bit is in the pitfalls and the alternative outcomes, right? So you have an opportunity to discuss, what are the weaknesses of your grant? What are the weaknesses of my research program? What are the pitfalls that we might anticipate? What things could go wrong? A really silly pet peeve of mine is when you read a grant and the grant writer says, we do not anticipate any pitfalls. Oh my goodness. That tells me that you have not thought through these experiments, or you may not have the expertise to carry out these. There is pitfalls to every single experiment, right? And you need to think deeply about that. And then alternatively, we'll talk about this. What happens if you do the experiment and it comes out completely different, opposite of what you proposed, right? How are you going to account for that? Are there alternative hypotheses that might explain that? And that also tells me that this grant writer has really thought about these experiments and what they might find from this. And so if there's no alternative, we expect this and this and this, and that's it. I'm like, I've been doing this a long time. There's always an opposite outcome that you don't anticipate, right? So think about that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then certainly putting a timeline. This ensures that your grant is not too ambitious, that you've thought about actually how much time this is going to work. So a timeline will kind of tie this all together and say, okay, my budget is appropriate. I can get all this work done in the proposed amount of time, and I'm going to show you this is how I'm going to allocate my time to get these done. Because being overambitious in a grant is a super common problem. And so the timeline will help close that circle on that. Okay. Other things, as we mentioned, there's other stuff that you got to do. If you're using vertebrate animals or some sort of component, a regulatory component, human subjects, you can't skimp on that. You have to do those well. You have to have an authentication plan if you're writing to NIH. If you're writing a multi-PI plan, you've got to have that. If you have foreign components, you've got to make sure all your letters of support, we'll talk about all of these. If you're writing a mentoring plan or some sort of T or F award, the training components are critically important, and you cannot skimp on all of those, any of those. So make a checklist early on so that you know you have to complete those. Many people will share features of their grants that give you an idea of how to sort of write these or do these. And that's certainly something that we as an INBRE program can provide as well. If you're like, well, I've never written a multi-PI plan before, email me and I will show you all of the multi-PI plans that I've written in the past. Okay, step one, I think I'm going to write a grant. How do I get started? You have to have some way, some process to organize your thoughts. I think that is very different for everybody. I've chased this throughout my entire lifetime. I kind of now have it down to an art. I use the whiteboard that's right behind me as my grant writing staging process. You can use a sketch pad, PowerPoint, whatever. I'm a visual thinker. I like to see things organized such that I can use that to sort of kind of look at the interplay of my particular grants. This particular example, do not plagiarize me, is a grant that I'm working on for October. So I'm trying to sort of think about all of the things that we have, what we need to do, how these fit together, and making a organizational structure that I can sort of come into my office, and I literally do this every day, and I sort of kind of stand there and I look at it and I stare and I scratch my head and I think about this and I'll tweak it. But this is an ongoing process for me all of the time. I generally always have a grant proposal that's written on my whiteboard behind me for the next thing that's moving forward. I'm not saying a whiteboard is the best approach. I'm just saying it works for me. It allows me to start to think about the data that we have. What do we need? How might this organizational structure be organized into a grant that is not dependent on each other and that is appropriate in terms of the workload? So I think it's really important for you to have a process where you can step back and think about this. It allows you to look for dependency across the aims. You don't want aims to be dependent on each other. And then how much is this, right? So I might, in this particular example, really boil this down into using just one of these aims and building that out into 3 aims. Because right now, as I look at it, it's probably over ambitious. So I need to really think about where I want to go with this. But this is my process. A lot of scribbling and stuff that doesn't make sense to anybody else, but it allows me to sort of kind of see this in a visual fashion, such that when I'm ready to translate that into a written document, I have a pretty good idea of what are our primary outcomes, what are the types of experiments that we're going to do, and what's the feasibility of, and then what is it going to tell us. So again, don't plagiarize me and submit this to NIH. This is going to go in October. All right, we're going to spend what I consider pretty good chunk of time on just one page of the grant, and that's the specific aims page. On the right side of the screen is actually my R01 that I renewed 3 years ago. And I already have read this multiple times and don't like a lot of what I wrote, but it got funded. Got funded with a great score. So I'm using this as an example to highlight some aspects of a specific aims page that I think are critically important. Can't emphasize enough, this is probably the most important page in your grant. This is where they start. This is what they're going to read very quickly and get a sense of what you're going to do. This is probably going to change, it's probably going to influence their enthusiasm more than any other page, I think. So appropriately, I spend more time on this page than I do any other section of my grant. I might spend the first 2 weeks of my process going from the whiteboard to this page back and forth to kind of try and get it where I'm happy with it. I like the flow of it. They're not dependent, and I can see what I need to do in terms of filling out the rest of the grant. So a lot of discussion points. I've had many discussions with people over the years about how many aims should you have. And I think that's dependent on how long is the funding period, right? If you have 1 year to do research, 5 aims in a grant proposal is guaranteed over ambitious, right? It's going to happen. How can you organize your thoughts? And I go back to the whiteboard, and that's what I'm trying to use the whiteboard for. How can I easily organize my thoughts into a written document that allows me to convey that? I generally feel that the fewer aims that you have, the better off that you are. Most of the grants that I write either have 2 or 3 aims. I think people have very different opinions on this, and they might write 5 aims. But think about what you're doing. You're asking the reviewer in a single page to remember 5 things versus 2 things, right? I think that it is more useful for me to condense my thoughts into 2 things that the reviewer can remember versus having a whole laundry list of things that they need to remember just based off this page. So my philosophy, and as I've gotten more experienced and older, I'm writing fewer and fewer aims. In fact, most of the grants that I'm writing have 2 aims. That's all I'm going to do. And if I can't fit it into 2 aims, maybe I don't need to do those experiments. So again, that's debatable. I've seen successful grants with 5, 6 aims, but you're pushing your luck, I think, in terms of asking the reviewer to remember what you want to do for this particular part. A good thing that I have listed at the very bottom, and this I think is a really important point, is to add space to your grant, right? Let the reviewer breathe between paragraphs. If you have a page that's completely filled with text, that's actually depressing for me to kind of go through and read. I need a moment to read a paragraph and breathe and catch my breath. So what you'll see in my document generally is a full space between paragraphs. You can see that I like justified right. That's my preference. And you can see that I don't cut these sentences off so it ends at the end of the paragraph here on the right side. I leave this intentionally to give space to the reviewer so that they can breathe between paragraphs. Again, that's thinking about what the reviewer is doing. They're reading 10 grants, right? If they get hammered by a full page of text that's really tight and very small, that's gonna make them tired, right? And that's immediately gonna change maybe their enthusiasm of the grant, right? So spacing to me is a critically important aspect of grant writing. Allow them time to breathe between paragraphs and catch their breath. And then you'll see, and again, this is debatable, oftentimes you'll commonly see some sort of graphic that illustrates or highlights what you're going to do. In this case, I basically simply iterated the main features of the two aims that I'm going to do. I was looking at axon regeneration in one aim, and then I was looking at pain in the other. And so that graphic is not spectacular. It's very rudimentary, but what it does is reinforce to the reviewer the two primary things that I'm looking at. And in the legend, I've actually restated that the aim in a very shortened aspect of that. So I'm hoping that when the reviewers read this, they're like, okay, I know what Wright is doing. He's going to look at axon growth and he's looking at a pain component. So that immediately gives them the ability to sort of kind of move forward and think about what I'm doing as that. So that is a general sense, the aims page, but we're going to break this down even more. So the first section of your grant is you're going to introduce the question, the problem, right? So I generally try and do this in 2 paragraphs. Why is this important, right? So this is a mini synopsis of the first couple paragraphs that are going to come into place. So here you want to provide relevant details, but you want to keep it simple. You have a lot more room to really build on this. I've seen lots of specific aims pages that try to cram in all of this information into the top of the page, and then they had no room at the bottom to really write their aims. Keep it simple, keep it at a high level, and really kind of introduce the problem with this. I generally provide a long-term goal to kind of see where the reviewers can, where this grant is going to lead. I use a broad view. I have a hypothesis generally, but I also use lay terms. I try not to get too far in the weeds. I was looking at this page yesterday and I was like, oh, I already introduced 4 abbreviations into this page. I hit my limit with this particular page. So I try not to abbreviate here. And again, this is a fast read for most of the reviewers. They're going to buzz through this and they want to get a general sense of what you're doing. So again, at the bottom, use good spacing, let them breathe as they go through this page. The second part of this section is the aims component, right? So a hypothesis is kind of set up the stage, and then I have 2 aims. One thing I think I've tried to do over my years as a grant writer is to shorten dramatically the aims, right? If you write an aim 1, we're going to test the ability of this to impact this system on these things, and we're going to look at all of this. That is a lot for a reviewer to kind of read and get a sense of what you're doing. So what you'll see is I write very specific short sentences that, and this is probably where I spend most of my time. How can I write a sentence? And what you'll see is that I've written them as questions. This is, again, a hotly debated topic. I get pushback sometimes from other grant writers, but I don't get it from the reviewers. I write my aims as a question so that they can sort of kind of see what we're doing specifically. I keep it short. I keep it bolded, and then I follow up oftentimes with a short hypothesis related to that. And then I try and focus on really what are the things that we're going to do, not getting too far in the weeds, because that's what the research design is for, but giving them a sense that this is, these are the things that we're briefly going to do. Again, I've reviewed many grants where I've read this page and there's 5 aims and I have no idea what they're doing after I've read it, right? So again, making it easy on the reviewers is critically important for that. Spacing, let them breathe. I've broken it up with a figure to kind of give a sense that it's not a full page of text. Then the other thing that you need to do is make sure that your aims are not dependent on each other. Again, that's where I go back to that whiteboard. Are these aims, if I do aim 1 and I am successful, or if it fails, let's say I do aim 1 and it fails, and now I propose to do work in aim 2, but it only is going to be relevant if I was successful in aim 1. That's a fatal flaw. It's an easy bad score in your grant. Most people are really good at picking those out. So make sure that they're not dependent on that, on each other. Again, that's where that whiteboard kind of goes back and forth to kind of check to say, okay, is this dependent on this? And you don't want them dependent. Finally, I really like a conclusion. This is a teaser for me about the innovation of the grant. And this tells them why, in a broader sense, this is important. So if you're interested in translatability, how might this translate to changing the way we practice, how we treat patients, how we do things moving forward, how this might lead to drug discovery or new aspects. So again, this is a sort of a kind of a teaser into the innovation of the grant. Why should they be interested in this? You do not want to repeat the previous sections. Don't just restate your aims. I like to use really strong distinctive terms, right? I think that this is something that you learn over time as a grant writer, is you can be a little stronger here without being overconfident, but you need to use strong terms here. So things that this is going to affirm or confirm or validate or things like that, that suggests that this grant is incremental, right? So I use key strong terms here that really kind of sets that apart. I usually offset it with italics. That's just my style, but I kind of want to sort of pull them back in. Sort of broaden back out so the reviewer can sort of see this. So in a general sense, we open very broadly. We get more focused as we go through the aims, and then I broaden that back out so they can go, oh, okay, I can see why he would want to do that, because this is really, the potential for identifying new drugs is right there. So I can see that, and you kind of help walk them through that process. So there's an art to it. And this is where I spend probably 70% of my time on this single page. Once I have this page where I like it, then the rest of the grant kind of falls in place, right? Because now I have a template. Okay, now I need to go through and work on aim 1 and go through this. And we're going to show you how the process in which I might do that as well. So again, I can't emphasize enough. This is oftentimes the make or break of your grant, because this is what the reviewer is going to look at first, generally speaking. A little bit about if there's an innovation section or there's a place to sort of kind of sell your grant. Again, that's exactly what you're doing. You're selling your grant, right? So what is new and different about this proposal? What are there new advances to make your experiment work? Are there new ideas or technologies that you're using? What new approaches do you use? What resources are unique that you've developed or have access to? This is the place to get this, to put this. This is a struggle. It's still a struggle for me to really come across as this is exciting and innovative versus overconfident and ridiculous, right? You don't want to make these bold grand proposals, but you want to be able to sort of sell your grant. So this is from another grant. This is a innovation section. We were really proposing very unique hypotheses here for these. We were identifying new signaling mechanisms, and then we were using an approach that is fairly rare in the United States, and so that adds innovation to this. So again, spend time on this. This is where I see a lot of new grant writers really struggle. They'll basically go in and restate their aims, or they'll restate some of things that are very obvious. This has to be unique and different. This has to kind of really sell your grant. And again, restating the expected results is it's not going to generate enthusiasm by the reviewer. They need to see why this is unique, and how it's going to move the field forward. Okay, a little bit about the research design. This is the meat and potatoes, right? This is where you're going to cover the background. Scientific premise is a relatively new term that we use in terms of the NIH. Adding rigor, or seeing how this is rigorous and reproducible work, is important. Addressing sex as a biological variable. This is where you're going to put your preliminary data and figures. This is where you're going to lay out the experiments that you're going to do. And again, we're going to come back and talk about these really key features, pitfalls and alternative outcomes, and timeline. So the first part of your research design is really where you have space to kind of sell the topic, right? And this term scientific premise really kind of came out in the 2013, 2014. NIH wanted to really kind of have grants that had a stronger justification. We used to have a lot of arguments at study section about what scientific premise actually was. So this is actually the NIH's definition. You're going to describe the background, basically the premise for the project, strengths and weaknesses of the published research. Is there a gap in the field that you're filling? Is there not enough known about this? Or preliminary data that's crucial to the support of your application, right? You've got a new great set of preliminary data. This is going to build a really strong case for the justification to carry out this work. Looking at where there's gaps in the field, I think, is really important. And so this is one of the things that oftentimes the reviewer will be asked to comment in. Did you feel like the scientific premise of the application was strong? So knowing that, I put in my document a sentence, generally around the second or third paragraph: the scientific premise of this proposal is based on this. So when they have to go and find that information, it's very easy for them to find. They don't have to kind of read 5 paragraphs and put together, okay, I think this is the case. I hand it to them on a platter. The scientific premise of this is based on these key features, right? Sometimes I'll add a schematic illustration to really kind of done that. I've done that where I've identified gaps in the field or things that I think are really important to that. And I'll restate my hypothesis. But again, handing that information to them on a platter makes it super easy for them to go, yeah, hey, the scientific premise is great. It's right here. And then everybody opens up the document and goes and looks at that as well. So again, this is kind of a common theme about, I think, what are important to write grants is hand the reviewers the information they need in order to evaluate your grant. I think this is a really important point too, is that over the years, we certainly need to increase the rigor and reproducibility of our science. And that, I mean, if you sit in any sort of webinar, you'll be stunned at how we have a lack of rigor and reproducibility. And so most applications will ask you, or you're being evaluated on that, as well as sex as a biological variable, if it's relevant to the things that you're doing. But most biomedical research, it is important. So I, again, hand this information right to the reviewer fairly early. I have a separate heading that makes it stand out: rigor and reproducibility. And I've here add an example of one of grants that I've written in the past, and I've kind of in red highlighted things that were important in this grant application in terms of how we're going to carry out that research to make sure that it has rigor and reproducible. So we were doing blinded experiments. We had ample sample sizes. We had statistics. We had addressed variables like age, weight, and health. We told them how we were going to do our statistics. And then I have a separate component as sex as a biological variable, using equal numbers of males and females to identify. This is critical. For example, if you don't even think that there's going to be sex differences, it takes one sentence to say, in the history of the field, there's been no sex differences, and so we are not going to do it. Although I think that's crazy not to to say it. But sometimes there are experiments where you can't, like for example, spinal cord injury is a common example where it's tough to do that in females because you have to express the bladder. So most of that research is done in males, but there's a justification component that you have to sell to the reviewer to state, okay, this is why we're not looking at sex differences. Do not scrimp on this. Hand them this information because this might be something that the study section might say, look, did you feel like the document had sufficient rigor and reproducible? In my grants, the reviewer go, yeah, he has a whole section right here on this, right? It's all laid out very nicely. Nicely is a generalized term. I don't know if they like this or not, but I've never had any comments about, or reading other people's. If I have to go search for that information, it takes time away from me learning about what you want to do. So I hand it right to them so they can see it. The research design, you're going to put in preliminary data. We talked a little bit about this. I see lots of grants that have data in there that's not relevant to the proposal, right? That's a big no-no. Only put in what's relevant to your proposal. You got to have a figure legend for your figure. That sometimes is a super pet peeve for reviewers. You didn't reference it in a text and there's no legend to that, right? Because oftentimes we go to the figures, and so that might draw my eye first. And if there's no legend, again, you should be concerned about their enthusiasm for that, and that's pulling away from that. Super big no-nos. Make sure all your graphs are labeled X, Y. Make them large enough to see. We've talked about that. Again, that's something that you're going to have to evaluate. Bigger the better, right? And I use figures again to break up the text to ease the spacing of that. Sometimes I'm like, this is a really important piece of data, but I'm struggling. Think about putting it as a table, right? It adds, it breaks up the document a little bit. It's a different way to kind of illustrate the data. So sometimes a table works really well to kind of summarize some of the key data instead of having a big graph that takes up so much room. So we'll kind of look at that, and that's something that we do at the end. We're like, okay, this just doesn't look good. I can't make it fit. Well, what about a table? Okay, let's put a table in, and it breaks up the document a little bit. So other things about the research design, this is where you're going to lay out your experiments, right? Describe them in lay terms. Remember, not everybody that's reviewing your grant is going to be an expert in the field in terms of the techniques that you use, right? So be careful about that and try to use lay terms that are actually related to your aims. I've seen lots of grants where the aims page didn't match up with the experimental design just because maybe you wrote the aims page first, and then as you evolved in the grant writing, you changed the experiments and they don't line up. Clearly describe controls. Use a positive and negative control if you can, and every time that will improve your rigor. Include your sample sizes, sex, and if there's statistics specific to that experiment, put them in there. It's okay to kind of really talk about, look, we're going to have to analyze this in a different fashion. These are the stats that we're going to use. If you're using assays that are common, think carefully about filling up space using methods that are very common, right? So for example, what I see oftentimes is in experimental design, I'll see a very large method sections on some pretty basic common use stuff. Again, that's up to your judgment, and you've just used up all of that space that you could have been discussing some other areas that I'll talk about. And that's really a common thing that I see. Including a timeline at the end. I'll show you what I generally do, and I've actually pulled this from some other people who are doing it better than me. And if you're doing clinical or educational research, make sure that you're carefully looking at your primary and secondary outcomes, right? So really hand this to the reviewer in terms of, these are our primary outcomes, this is our secondary outcomes. It's a little bit different type of language that you might use. Again, be aware of your spacing. Let the reviewer breathe throughout the pages. I absolutely will never have just a blank or just a full page of text, right? I will not do that. So I want every page to have the reviewer have a break in terms of what they're reading. So this is kind of a common, this is a grant I wrote, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. In fact, you can actually see the paragraph marks that I sort of kind of focus on here. Lots of spacing in between. Here are the figures. I have a figure legend here. I hope I referenced this figure on this page. Generally, I would do that probably. If not, I made a mistake. I add lots of spacing here. And then I start generally these pages with a statement of my aim that came from the aims page. Make sure that that's the same as what you wrote on your aims page. I've done that 100 times where I end up tweaking the aims on the aims page and I didn't tweak it. I didn't, correct it here. So the aims were actually different. Again, using underlining and italics and bold is kind of a, less is better. I think I try and stay consistent across that. One of the things I do right before I submit is I just go and look at all of the italics and underlining and bolding and try and reduce that and also make sure it's consistent across that. It just is more appealing, if you're jumping around and you have something underlined or you have something italicized and that detracts from the reviewer's concentration on what you're trying to get done in the grant. Again, that's you're hurting yourself. So just make it consistent across that. I would say one of the places where early grant writers kind of fall down is really this section, the pitfalls and alternative outcomes. Probably this component I spend more time on with the exception of the specific aims page. I really sort of think about that. So I'll lay out a series of experiments and then I'll sort of kind of spend time on the pitfalls. If I'm honest, what could go wrong with these experiments, right? There is always something that could go wrong, right? If the reagents are in short supply, it's if you've never done that particular technique, we don't have a lot of experience, but we've added collaborator X to help us bolster that, to work through problems that might arise as part of that. So this is kind of that next level grant writing where you really understand what you're doing. And there are things that can go wrong. So as I mentioned earlier, if I see somebody that says we don't anticipate any pitfalls, I'm like, oh my goodness, right? Of course there's going to be pitfalls. And this is your chance to show the reviewer that you are kind of thinking about this in a really deep level. And then how I will always point out pitfalls, but I always sort of say, and this is how we're going to address this. These are our backups, right? These are things that we can do to overcome these pitfalls. The alternative outcomes section is a little bit different. Think about what the results might be. And I try and list at least 2 or 3 possible outcomes for each aim for sure. What happens if we get the complete opposite result? And I'll tell you, this happens constantly, right? I propose a hypothesis, my students do the experiment, it's completely opposite of what I thought. That doesn't mean we're dead in the water. That just means that the biology is complex and we've got to figure out a way to interpret that, right? So here's a chance for you to kind of walk through possible scenarios. If this happens and this happens, this supports this hypothesis and this is consistent with this, this aspect. The second one, if we see completely opposite, this is how we might interpret that. What are the things that we might be able to sort of think about that would help explain that opposite result? Again, this to me demonstrates that you've really thought through these experiments. I spend a lot of time here. In a lot of grants, you'll see really detailed methods and then a very condensed pitfalls and alternative outcomes. Flip it. Methods can be very short. Think about your experiments and pitfalls and outcomes, and that's where I think you really can sell your grant because you've shown that you've really thought about this. And that will help you from the innovation standpoint too, right? You're thinking about, oh, okay, there's, if we get this result and it's not what I thought, we're not dead in the water. This just means that it's really cool and biology is complex. So to me, that's kind of exciting to kind of go through this process because I'm like, what happens if we get completely opposite? And then the student will go, and I'm like, yeah, it's going to happen, right? We're going to get something completely opposite of this. So let's be prepared for that. Let's think through that. References, pretty straightforward. Don't over-reference, right? If you get the chance and you know who the reviewers are, NIH publishes the rosters. I think having an understanding of who your reviewers are important. That doesn't mean you write to those reviewers. You write your document based on what you think they want to see. But I think certainly understanding what, in terms of the breadth of the field, who's in this field and what is published, I think is really important. I've seen hundreds of times where the applicant will write and just cite their own work, right? And what it does is it shows that you have probably maybe not read the literature, because there's a lot of literature out there, and that maybe you're, as an investigator, might not be experienced in this field. So just be prepared to sort of think about what other people have published, and certainly there's going to be different hypotheses than you. So citing your own work, I think, is a really bad mistake. I think you need to really be aware of there's other people out in the field. What are they thinking? What are they proposing? And to really kind of highlight that. And then there might be specifics in the FOA about, okay, you're limited to 35 references. So if you go over that, again, you've irked the reviewer, because they're like, well, they didn't pay attention to the limits, and now that the document is full of references that they didn't need. So again, it's about really providing them an opportunity to be enthusiastic about your application, and when you deviate from that, you're asking for trouble. Okay, so from a timeline standpoint, I really wasn't good at this early on. I actually, this is a timeline that one of my students actually wrote or an example of this. I kind of like this. I use this graphic. This was for a 5-year application. I broke it down into aims, and so that the reviewers can sort of say, okay, yeah, I can see that he actually knows that breeding this colony of animals is going to take a long time. And so he's aware of that as that process. And we work through the aims of that. So one, this guarantees that you've thought about the ambitious nature of your grant proposal, because if you get to this point, you're like, oh, well, yeah, that's not realistic because I proposed 5 years worth of work for 2. That's going to hurt you. So this allows you to kind of check on that. It allows you to be realistic about the studies. And then if you can sort of illustrate in a graphic or a table, again, it breaks up the text. It allows them to sort of kind of look at that you've really thought about this, and that you're at least aware of the amount of time that's going to happen for that. A couple other sort of points here. I think we're okay on time. You may likely need letters of support, right? This is something that you kind of need to think about fairly early on. I'm guilty of really sort of thinking about this fairly late, and then I ask my letter writers to write a letter that's fairly late in the process, and that's not fair to them. I'm working on getting better at that process, but sometimes you get to a point where you're like, well, this aim is really turning into something a little bit different, and you know what? I don't have the expertise here, and so now I need to go get a letter of support. So that's my excuse for asking people fairly late in the process. I'm trying to get better at it, and hopefully you will be. But you're going to be reviewed as the investigator. That is a component. They're going to look at your biosketch, your publications, your grant history, whatever. And then, do you have the expertise to do that? I learned a hard lesson. My first R01 grant, I didn't ask. I was a junior investigator. I was too scared to ask somebody else from the field to help me with that. I got criticized saying, look, this person's new to the field, and clearly they didn't know the literature as well as they could, and they didn't come from a lab that studies this, and that's a weakness, right? I immediately understood that, and I sort of got over the fear of asking big people in the field to be on my grant, either as a collaborator or as a consultant. What it does is it allows the reviewer to see that you understand where your level of that expertise is and you need help, right? It's super easy. I have never turned down anybody who's asked me to be a collaborator or a consultant on a grant. It's super easy. When you ask them for letters of support, generally speaking, it's common courtesy to write a draft for them so they don't have to write something de novo. That, again, takes time. So you need to build that time in, that you're going to have to perhaps write a draft for every letter writer. And don't be afraid to ask them. You got to have the appropriate expertise. The opposite side of that is make sure the letters have a purpose, right? So putting in a bunch of letters to overcompensate to make sure that you feel like, okay, they're going to think I'm great as an investigator. If it doesn't have a purpose, it's going to hurt you, right? So make sure that there's intent with every letter, right? Does it have value? Does it add value to your document? I see lots of grants that have tons and tons of letters, but they're not relevant to the proposal. I'm like, what? Why? You just made me read this letter that this has nothing to do with, your proposal. So think about what you need to include in your document and really add letters that have value to your document. And then again, Doug, ask for letters early. I'm constantly working on that process to make sure that I give my letter writers time to sort of kind of do that appropriately. So a little bit about the grant process. Every agency is different. NIH has study sections. There's a person that's leading that. It's called the Scientific Review Officer, the SRO. Within NIH, there are clusters of study sections. That's all online. You can find all this information. You can go and look at the study section rosters to see, for the last 3 years, who's consistently been, who are regular members on the study section. I do spend time on this. I don't exactly write my grants to the reviewers, but I'm aware of who's reviewing it. And if I know that I'm have a very different opinion than somebody who's constantly reviewing these grants, I'm going to address that. I'm going to make sure that that person knows that I recognize their or other contributions in the field, and how does my proposal fit with that or contrast with that. I think it's a really good sort of thing to do. And then if ever you get the chance, always request a study section. We have very little control in the process about who the reviewers are. But if you do get an opportunity, take advantage of that to try and get your grant in front of the right people. Sometimes it doesn't work out and the SRO says, no, we're going to bounce this to a different one. And that can be a benefit, but oftentimes it's not. So if you get the chance to ask or to put in a request, always do so. It doesn't mean that it's going to go to that study section, but at least you try to get it into the right place. So I definitely recommend that if possible. Okay, so we're not going to do this today, but normally when I do this workshop, we then stop at the end and we actually everybody writes an AIMS page themselves. And this is the process in which I start every single AIMS page. I do it in 8 sentences. The first 3 sentences, I write a single short sentence highlighting the topic that I'm interested in, why it's important, and what is the gap in the field, right? This allows me to, this is like my table of contents. I can do this very fast. This is not a 20-word sentence. This is a sentence of 6 to 10 words. Bang, right? I write it very quickly, and that allows me to kind of organize as a table of contents my AIMS pages. The 4th sentence is a long-term goal. What are our long-term goals here? It might be to cure cancer or whatever it is that I want to kind of sort of think broadly about that. And then the 5th sentence is a hypothesis. What do I hypothesis? A single sentence in which I can put that hypothesis out. Then I write my 2 aims. Again, 6 to 8 word sentence, very concise. I write them as a question. Other people do not, but I write the first aim and then I write the second aim as important. I think about are they dependent on each other? And then I write a final conclusion sentence that allows me to sort of broaden back out and sort of kind of let the reviewer sort of see what the impact of this research is. So when I'm writing an AIMS page and I'm getting started and I've worked at my whiteboard for a long time, this is what I do. I'm like, okay, I'm writing 8 sentences today. I'm going to knock this out. That gives me a template now for which I can start to fill in those paragraphs and build that. I have sat and looked at an empty page too many times in my career. So I've got to figure out a way to get started in this process. This allows me to get started and to get that AIMS page moving forward. And again, I spend most of my time on this. So I've tried different ways to sort of do this. I think to me, going through that entire 8-sentence process really helps me sort of flow this. And then I probably I might throw that away and restart it. You know, I do that 1,000 times, but this is my process in which I sit at a blank page and go, I don't know what to write. Oh, you know what? I can write 8 sentences and I can get started as a template. So I'm not saying that that's how you should do it. I'm just trying to give you an example of how I've tried to overcome my procrastination, my, you know, freezing, looking at a blank page, and try and get this process moving forward, you know, and kind of get it organized. Again, going back for me, that's the whiteboard to this page. This is kind of where, you know, it starts to sort of, and then I start to get excited about that process. So again, this is not how you do this, but oftentimes if we had more time or doing a full day workshop, we would do this. Each of you would write 8 sentences relative to your work and try and get a you know, a table of context for your AIMS page. Part of that process too is to teach you to write short, direct sentences, right? Oftentimes when we do this with students, I'll be like, okay, write 3 sentences to introduce your topic, and it's 300 words. I'm like, that's not our goal here. We're here to write short sentences and to kind of move forward at getting that. And that also allows us to talk about clarity in your writing, right? Scientific writing is boring, right? I rarely use adjectives or adverbs anymore. Those are the first things I cut out. It allows me to shorten and condense that to get to the point. So I am going to stop here. I was hopeful. I know we've got some questions in the chat, and I'm happy to write that. Again, this was not meant to be, this is how you should do it. This was meant to be, this is how I do it. And, you know, these are the struggles that I face, and these are the ways that I try and overcome this. And then finally, grant writing is, the art of it is to understand that you're trying to capture the reviewer's enthusiasm. So everything you do to distract from that is going to move them away from being excited about your grant, and to being able to concisely talk about your grant with excitement to a group of people. And that should be your goal. And so I will stop there. Pull up your faces so I can see the audience, and I'm happy to work through some questions and take other questions that you might have, or criticisms. Absolutely. If you've got a better approach, let's hear it. I need good approaches. So, all right, I'm going to go through the chat.
I can read them too.
Here's some examples of R21 and R01s. Yes, we absolutely can do that. I'm trusting you not to plagiarize my grants, but I'm always happy to send you successful grants that you might be able to at least use as, you know, kind of, okay, I can see how much work is going to be required for that. So good question, and we will absolutely do that. If you ever feel like you want one of those, don't reach out to me because I won't read my email. But if you reach out to Claire or Hayata, they will bug me to the point where we'll get you that information. Do you recommend specific wording when discussing sex as a biological variable when it comes to include? Oh, that's a great question. That is a great question. Probably beyond my level of expertise at this particular point, but that's an important issue that we need to address for non-binary patients. I have a good colleague who just got a grant studying aspects of transitions for transgender patients, and she probably would have really great language for that. If you're ever curious, I can help direct you to her. I probably have not done a good job of that. Is there a difference between a letter of support and a letter of collaboration? Yes and no. Letter of collaboration should provide information about what your collaborator is going to bring to your project. We are going to do these 3 things in my laboratory for you. Sometimes, if I'm worried about my letter, let's say I feel like we can do the experiments in my lab, but it may be perceived that I don't have the experience to do that. I will ask for a letter of support, which is a little bit different, because the letter writer be like, I'm an expert in this field. I've been working with Dr. Wright. I'm super excited about his experiments, and we're going to guide him through the process of meeting on a quarterly basis or 6 months or whatever. Provide some details about that support aspect, not just saying, here's my letter of support. You know, really ask them to kind of outline how are you going to provide that support. We're going to meet in a quarterly basis to kind of go over the results and make sure that these experiments are moving in the right direction. So there are a little bit of subtleties in terms of support and collaboration. Collaboration's better define what you're going to do for that project, right? We're going to take these samples and we're going to process it through this machine, and and we're going to be involved in the data analysis and the paper writing, right? So that should all be outlined in a letter of collaboration. Good question, though. Okay, next question. Is there a suggested order of efficiency? Yeah. I've tried to portray this process like I know what I'm doing. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I always start with aims, first of all, right? Make sure that your grant can proceed in a way that you're like, okay, if you just dive into the experimental design and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, I wrote 10 years worth of work there, so that's ridiculous. So I try and start with the aims, and I try to do the experimental design and the data, preliminary data next. And then I want to go and do the pitfalls and outcomes after that, right? Because in that process, I need to be thinking about, is this experiment even feasible, right? Or is this ridiculous to think about? So by going through the pitfalls and outcomes after that, then that allows me to, okay, all right, this is feasible. We can do this, but it's also going to move the field forward, and this is the outcomes. I do the introduction to the research design and the innovation last. Those are things that you want to take away at the end when you've got the big picture, what you've done. Is that how it always happens? No. Sometimes I'll bounce around, I'll get stuck and I'll be like, I have no idea what to write. I'm just going to write a BS innovation component, right? Just to kind of keep moving. So, I'm pretty good at it, but I'm not terribly efficient at that. So, will NIH require IRB's approval prior to submission? Oftentimes, no, but in order to get the funding notice, you have to provide documentation of IRB or maybe animal care. So it just depends on the agency. You can, you really just sort of reach out to your potential program officer and see if they, be like, do I need IACUC approval? Sometimes you do, right? If you have some unique grant that you're writing that they want you to have IACUC or IRB approval beforehand, that might be a requirement. So again, reach out to the program officer and sort of check with that. Where to find the NIH reviewers roster? That should be, you just Google that fairly easily. Sometimes they're hard to chase down, but that's within the NIH CSR website. It's easily Googleable. That's a hard word to say. And you can track those down. And if you can't find it, let me know, and I can always help you with that. And again, sometimes the rosters are really up to date, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're changing. You can't guarantee that those folks are going to be at the study section, because everybody has lives and can't go to all of them. So, do you need to refer to the letter of support within the proposal text wherever applicable? I think that's generally a really good idea, right? Because you can direct them to that, right? You can establish that I need help with this particular area and I have a letter of support. You don't have to go through in detail, but you could say, I generally say, see letter of support from, this particular person, just so it kind of helps guide them to say, oh, look, yeah, he recognizes he's not that good at this. He needs help with this. And the letter is right there. I'm in the process of setting up a brand new lab, but I don't have any instruments. I will have access to my startup money. Congratulations on the new position. I have a grant ready to submit in June, but I'm facing a challenge with the equipment section of the proposal. Do you have any suggestions for addressing this issue, or would you recommend waiting and submitting the grant in October? That's a great question. I could see a reviewer getting hung up on that. Like if you didn't have an equipment section, and that is the ability for you to carry out these experiments is contingent on getting that experiment, I could see a reviewer getting hung up on that. To be maybe your environment, you could get knocked on the environment component. Like, okay, they are going to do these experiments, but they don't have the data yet. I would open that up to the rest of the experienced grant writers I can see here. That would be something that I would sort of kind of think about carefully. First of all, generally waiting for a grant. Sometimes you need to wait, sometimes you don't. I would try and get it in if you felt like, you could make the argument, we know this is coming, expected date's going to be here, blah, blah, blah. They might, the funding agencies might say, you know what, we're going to wait to give you the funding notice until, we're going to wait to give you the money until we know that you have this. So there may be some negotiation with that. That's a tough one. That's a good challenge that I'm not sure I have a great answer for. You kind of have to sort of balance that. Yes, definitely we'll make a copy of these slides available. I have it in PowerPoint in PDF form, and we'll send it out. Claire and Hayata will be able to make this available to that. So, and I think the recording will be available too. Do you read what you have written in your grant out loud? Well, according to my last INBRE submission, I should have. Do I read it out loud? Yes and no. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Oftentimes, if I have somebody else read it, I might not read it out loud. But yes, you're right. I think that's a great sort of thing. I think using Grammarly has helped me with that a lot because it really picks up useless words that I use all the time, right? Something doesn't need to be very, very significant. It's just significant, right? So if you read it out loud, that's another approach that you can use to clarify the language and make sure that it sounds right. Reading it aloud really kind of picks up run-on sentences. That's where I think it's really good. Like if you write, a really long run-on sentence and then you read it out loud, you're like, okay, that's crazy. I need to do better on that particular sentence. Grammarly will also pick that up as well, but that's a good point. That's a great suggestion. I'll probably say I haven't done it as much as well. And listen, I think that's a great idea too, because I've read my own grants 1,000 times before I submit it, and then you submit it and you're like, oh my gosh, here's the worst sentence that I've ever written in my entire life right there, and I'm like, why didn't I catch that? So I do think that that's a good strategy as well. And I will say that question writer is also a very experienced grant writer, so I would take that suggestion to heart as well. Okay, so I think
we
that's
missed a couple questions, Doug. Do you have any thoughts on adding a figure in the specific aims page?
I've kind of flipped on this a little bit. There's no right or wrong, unless there is some component that say no figures in the specific aims page. I've written proposals that basically said do not put figures in the aims page. My philosophy now is I do use a graphic because one, the graphics, like if you use like a program for BioRender, the graphics are much better. I'm not a graphic artist, but I can feel confident. What I would say is that don't make it super complicated. If you're going to use a figure in your specific aims, really use it to help remind the reviewer what your aims are, right? Don't have some big signaling pathway that's not really relevant at that point or not needed. Don't use it until you need it. So I make a very simple graphic, and the point is to try and reinforce the 2 or 3 things that I'm doing with my specific aims. And I also use it to break up that page visually to kind of give the reviewer a little breather in terms of reading that. I would say generally almost all the time I'm using a graphic now in the aims page. Small, simple, really just trying to reinforce what we're going to do in the aims. So.
And then the last question I think we missed was, do you have any advice or suggestions or tips for PUI folks on how to efficiently manage grant writing time? For example, writing during summer, saving a certain number of hours weekly, signing up for seminars, etc.
Yeah, this is kind of one of our goals is to help the investigators at the PUIs in this process, right? You have a really unique challenge of being incredibly busy throughout the semesters. And so that grant writing period, it gets really stressful. And so what we are trying to do is in part we're trying to set our deadlines for grant proposals in a place where it is helpful for you. And December is not great because you're finishing your semesters and you're grading, you're busy. And that's set in part by our need to get these grants reviewed by our start date of May 1st. So we're trying to help you early on in the process so that if you have time during the summer and you can work on that process to get it 60 to 70% done, and have time to start to then have other people read this and help you with that process. Grant writing time is hard because one, as a grant writer, I need sufficient pressure to motivate myself to write. No matter how excited I am, I have a mental block about writing. So I like to write very late in the process because there's incredible pressure and it just seems to come out very fast. That is not, I would not recommend that to anyone. That's just my style. If you can write during the summer and you want us to be involved in that process and help you, we are excited to do that for you so that by the time you get started in the semester, you're not trying to write a grant in November, which is, I know, is crazy because you're so busy. So we are kind of here to help you with that process. John Stanford, who I don't know if John is on, as the director of the DRPP Corps, we've talked a lot about being accessible and helping you write your grants, and helping you throughout that process. And we're ready to do that in the summer. So if you can write in the summer and get a draft of it and you want to run it, have our help with that, we are excited to kind of help you with that. And I will read your grant out loud to myself and kind of help you work on that aspect. I love that part. I love editing and helping people really shorten their grants, right? And my favorite thing is somebody come and say, I'm a page over and I don't know what to cut. I'm like, give it to me. Come on, I'll cut it. I love that part of it. So that's my superpower, is cutting grants down to page limits. So another question, will my
Real
grant...
quick, sorry, just if people want to hop off, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that the recording and the slides will be sent out and they'll be posted on our website as well. If you did not register on REDCap, I don't have your email, so you might want to put it in the chat, or you can register now. It's still on the flyer available, or you can contact the person who you maybe received the information from if you didn't register. Those are all options, but either way, it's going to be available on our website if you just want to check that out later too. So we can stay on for a few people that might still have some leftover questions if Dr. Wright is available.
Yeah.
But do want to be respectful of everyone's time with it being 2 p.m. So thanks for coming.
Anybody have another question that they'd like to ask?
There was one, yeah. Will my grant lose an ESI benefit if the second key personnel, a professor who works on the grant with me, does not have ESI status anymore?
That would probably be immediate question I would send to the program officer, to send him a quick email and ask that. I mean, if it's a multi-PI grant, I'm not sure. If you're the PI of the grant and you have ESI status, probably not. But that's a simple 4-sentence email to your program officer just to get clarification on that. I would just, just hit them right away, because that's important, right? If you're losing your ESI status, you might consider, changing the organizational structure of the grant so you could protect that. I would think that would be something that I would want to protect very much. That ESI status is critically important because ESI and early stage new investigator grants are reviewed generally separate from the more experienced. So when we do study section, we'll review all the main R01s that are not ESI, and then we'll review those. And that is a different mentality as a reviewer, because you quickly can adjust to, okay, this is a group of people that does not have the experience of the grants that we just read. So it's a reset and allows the reviewers to kind of think about, all right, let's review this grant in context of where that person is in their career. And they're not going to have the publication record or the resources or the experience or anything that the rest of the ones that we've just done. So, protecting that ESI status is critically important. So I would just fire off an email to the program officer just to double check. They should be able to answer that very quickly. So other questions that folks have? It's your chance to expose my inexperience and my naivety about grant writing. If not, thank you very much. We're happy as a INBRE staff to kind of help you, whether you're submitting a grant to the INBRE or whether you're writing to an agency or foundation. We are available to kind of help and provide some oversight. If you have budget questions or you're stuck on stuff, Hayat is a terrific resource. She's done 1,000 budgets in her lifetime probably, so can help you with that. So, all righty, thank you so much.